But what I'm saying is, like, for example, let's say somebody involved in resistance exercise, the need to stuff yourself with carbohydrates right after the workout is ridiculous because, first of all, you're not going to completely exhaust your glycogen stores. But if you train with high intensity, you'll exhaust more than, let's say, a person who just does this stuff and goes through the motions. You're not going to exhaust. You're lucky to exhaust maybe 15% of the glycogen if you do that.
Hello and welcome. I am Coach Castle, a certified biomechanics expert, nutritionalist, and efficiency coach. Subscribe to this channel to learn the most efficient ways to maximize your muscle growth and recovery, enhance your body, and advance your mind, all using the latest science. Welcome to Castle's Corner.
I'm very much into science. Don't get me wrong. I'm really big on science. My whole newsletter is based on provable science. You know what I mean? And the thing is that, unfortunately, there's a lot of science that a lot of people swear by that I just don't agree with because of my actual common sense observations. For example, a lot of research I see online, a lot of research will say carbohydrates cannot make you fat. And to me, yeah, they say that no amount of carbohydrates can make you fat because your liver will oxidize the excess. Really, the only thing in my life that ever made me fat was excess carbohydrates.
Yeah.
I've gone on diets, so-called ketogenic diets. Oh, and on the flip side of that is the only thing that makes you fat is dietary fat.
Yeah, I've heard that. There's not science behind that, I don't think.
No, they've come out with studies. They say the only thing that produces body fat is excess dietary fat. You cannot get fat from a protein or carbohydrate. Now, here's the deal. When I was a bodybuilder, I always started out my diet with what they call a ketogenic diet. I literally lived on protein and no carbohydrates at all, but I ate a good amount of fat. Some of these ketogenic diets that are used to treat epilepsy, they have involved as much as 70% fat. That's a lot of fat, 70% of calories. I think I ate maybe 60% of my calories as fat. According to them, that amount of fat, I should have been getting fat like a house because I was eating all this fat, and yet I got leaner and leaner and leaner.
You can even eat more calories, protein and fat, and you won't get fat. You won't gain weight. You'll lose weight.
Happened.
I should say you lose fat. I should be specific. You lose fat if you do that.
And you might say, well, that's anecdotal, but every person I've observed, and I'm talking about hundreds over the years that use that kind of diet, never ever gained fat on a low carb, high fat. Never, not one person.
Yeah, I want to look up the study. That makes absolutely no sense. It goes against all science I've read, actually,
right. Look it up.
I know personally.
Do a search for dietary fat is what produces body fat, and I'm sure you'll come up with a couple of studies that claim that.
Oh, that's insane.
Utter nonsense.
But you know what? We're talking about carbohydrates now. Let's talk about how carbohydrates are muscle sparing, and if you're doing high intensity, you got to have carbs.
Yeah, well, the primary fuel, as you know, for anaerobic exercise is glycogen and glucose. Muscle glycogen is basically a stored form of, it's a long chain carbohydrate of glucose units. It's a bunch of glucose units attached, and it's stored in the liver and the muscles. The type of glycogen stored in the liver is for systemic glucose use. In other words, whenever your blood glucose or blood sugar gets low, there's a signal sent to the liver. It breaks down the stored glycogen into glucose and raises your glucose back up. That's a body mechanism to keep you alive because your brain needs a certain amount of glucose, your central nervous system. Now, the interesting thing is that the other area of the body that stores glycogen is the muscles. Now, unlike the liver, which can break down glycogen, it's called glycogenolysis for release of glucose into the blood. There's certain enzymes in the liver that do that. These enzymes don't exist in muscle. So glycogen, the point being, glycogen stored in muscle can only be used by that particular muscle. Once the glycogen is exhausted, and what the studies show, this is very interesting. Earlier studies show, this relates to high intensity training. Listen to this. If you do 3 sets of an exercise, just 3 sets, the glycogen in muscle is depleted by 24 to 48%, depending on intensity level. The higher the intensity level, the more the glycogen is depleted. Now, They used to think it's only 48% depleted at most, even if you go to failure. Recent studies have found, this is very recent, apparently glycogen is stored in different parts of the muscle. They thought it was stored in what just a particular, it's all over the muscle. So what does that mean in practical terms? You actually exhaust more glycogen than they originally thought. If you train to high intensity, you can actually probably, I'm just a figure, I don't really know if anyone's ever looked into it. I estimate you could exhaust as much as probably 80% of the muscle glycogen in a particular muscle. Now you say to me, well, what if somebody keeps working out after that when the glycogen is, let's say 80% gone? What happens? Well, as a byproduct of glycogen metabolism in muscle, you get remember I talked about those metabolic byproducts. One of them is lactic acid. And now lactic acid, what happens is the acid differentiates from the lactate. Now the acid portion of lactic acid is a fatigue producing substance, because when the pH or acid level of muscle goes down, energy producing enzymes in muscle turn off. So the muscle's dead. High acidity in muscle is a fatigue exercise factor. There's no doubt about that. But it's different for lactate. Lactate is not a fatigue factor. The lactate produced in the muscle gets out of the muscle, travels in the blood to the liver, and in a process called gluconeogenesis, the lactate is converted, get this, into glucose, and it travels back to the muscle. Now the muscle has more fuel to keep going. They call it the Cori cycle in biochemistry. See, so it's amazing how the body has all. And another interesting thing is, this is one of my favorite studies. You know how they say you have to have a lot of carbohydrate to replenish muscle, the glycogen, both muscle and liver glycogen. If you exhaust it, let's say your endurance guys really exhaust the glycogen. Those long, they have they call it hitting the wall. If you ever watch a track meet, some of these marathon runners, they look like they're like having polio.
I mean, I've done it. I've been there.
Yeah, I mean, if your glycogen's completely exhausted, your muscles literally, I mean, it's like running a car with no gas. It's not going to move. That's the way it works. But what they found is that they did a study, because like the prevailing thought is the best way to replenish glycogen in both liver and muscles is to eat carbohydrates. And related to endurance exercise, the faster you eat the carbohydrates, the faster you're going to get the glycogen replenishment, because the glycogen synthase enzymes, which convert carbohydrate or glucose into glycogen, are more active. They're stimulated by exercise or by glycogen depletion. So again, the prevailing thought being, if you really want to replenish your glycogen, eat quick-acting carbs. Don't worry about fiber. Eat even the junky carbs. Get them in there. Within 2 hours after a training session, you'll have a head start on glycogen replenishment. Now, what happens? Wait a minute. The flip side, what if you don't eat carbohydrate? Does that mean you get no glycogen replenishment? This is what the study entailed. They had two groups of men. One group did the usual, eating a lot of carbohydrate after the workout. The other group, get this, ate no carbohydrate, not even a single gram. Theoretically, they should have had no glycogen replenishment. 2 hours after they started the study, they were able to measure the amount of glycogen in the men that ate no carbohydrates. Ready? 75% replenished glycogen, 75% with zero carbohydrate. How could that happen? Lactate. The lactate traveled to the liver, became glucose. The glucose plus amino acids. Certain amino acids are what they call glycogenic. They also participate in gluconeogenesis. They also contribute to glycogen replenishment. The glycerol portion of triglycerides, which is fat. Triglyceride is 3 fatty acids attached to a glycerol backbone. The fatty acids can't be turned into glycogen, but the glycerol, 10% of the triglyceride molecule, meaning glycerol, that can be also gluconeogenesis converted into glycogen. There's your answer. That's how they were able to have 75% glycogen replenishment, no carbohydrate intake at all, none. And I'm not suggesting that, let's say, endurance athletes should do this, you know what I mean? Because they will get better and faster glycogen replenishment if they eat carbohydrates, don't get me wrong. But what I'm saying is, like, for example, let's say somebody involved in resistance exercise, the need to stuff yourself with carbohydrates right after the workout is ridiculous, because first of all, you're not going to completely exhaust your glycogen stores. But if you train with high intensity, you'll exhaust more than, let's say, a person who just does this stuff and goes through the motions. You're not going to exhaust, you're looking to exhaust maybe 15% of the glycogen if you do that. So yes, you have to have carbohydrate because if you're involved in high intensity training, because that is your primary fuel. Now, somebody on a low carb or ketogenic diet, they tend to, after a while, use ketones, which are metabolic byproducts of incomplete fat metabolism. They can be used by muscles as an energy source instead of glucose. The problem is that they're not great for high intensity training. I know this myself because when I used the ketogenic diet, when I compete in contests, even when I trained on the high intensity system, let's say I did 3 sets of an exercise. The first set would be normal. I'd be no problem, right? Second set, I noticed a little bit of fatigue, but not a great one. What happened was on the third set, let's say I wanted to do 8 reps, I couldn't even get 4 because what happened is the ketones were not effective. And I had high ketones because I was having no carbs. They just weren't effective to keep the muscle going after like 1 or 2 sets, the muscle died. So you can't escape the fact that you do have to have, if you're training with high intensity conditions, you have to have some carbohydrates. You will not be able to train effectively high intensity.
We should also mention, by the way, when you're working out, I mean, generally speaking, unless you're doing a really weird workout, you are not burning fat for fuel. You are burning your glucose. You're burning your stored carbohydrates for fuel. You're not burning fat. No matter how hard you exercise, I don't care how hard you're exercising, you're not burning fat.
There's one exception to that rule. That's very true. The primary sources of anaerobic, as I said, are circulating glucose and glycogen. That's what's powering it. But if you train for extended times, again, I'm not recommending this.
Weird workout, like I said.
Yeah, let's say you do a 2-3 hour workout. You are going to exhaust a little bit more. Your glucose is going to go down. Your glycogen is going to be partially exhausted. And once that happens, there's a protein enzyme in muscle is activated when the glycogen levels start to get low to a certain point. There's a substance activated called AMPK. Now, once AMPK is a fuel sensor in muscle, it's activated when levels of ATP or adenosine triphosphate, that's the immediate source of energy for muscles. Everything, glucose, all fats, everything eventually becomes ATP. It's produced in the mitochondria. That's your immediate elemental source of energy. Now, when you're working out, your energy stores are going to gradually drop the longer you train, right? So when the ATP gets low, in other words, when you go from ATP to ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate, and then you go to AMP. That's but that's just the progression. But when you go from ATP to ADP, that sets the signal for the release of AMPK. What does AMPK do? AMPK increases the ability of the muscle to burn or oxidize fat. But there's a caveat to that. We're not talking about the circulating free fatty acids. That's what you're referring to, not that, or the fat from your fat cells. What the fat that is tapped into is intramuscular fat. That's the fat between the muscle fibers. If you look at a fatty piece of meat, you see that marbling? That's intramuscular fat. That could be tapped into as a secondary energy source during extended exercise. That's the only fat you burn.
But even then, I mean, I was more referring to it. I know you've heard this before, but I'm trying to lose weight. Let me lift lighter weights faster.
No, it's not going to work. No.
No.
Let's even if you do aerobic now, I would say a lot of people. There's 2 purposes to do aerobic training. One is what people think. One of them is to oxidize or burn fat. The other one's for cardiovascular exercise, right? But what people don't realize is that, yes, fat is burned in the presence of larger amounts of oxygen. That's true. But if you do 30 minutes, let's say, of aerobics, for the first 30 minutes, you're only burning 50% glycogen. You're burning 50% glycogen and 50% free fatty acids that are circulating in the blood. The longer you do the exercise, for example, if you do a session of aerobics where you go to 90 minutes, I don't know why anyone would want to do that unless you're a ultra endurance runner, but let's say you did, you would probably be burning 70-80% oxidizing fat if you kept it at a not high intensity, because high intensity, the higher the intensity, the more the body has to go to carbohydrates, even with like interval training. Interval training, when you're doing high intensity intervals, you're burning glycogen and glucose. You're not burning fat, but you're raising your metabolism to such an extent that you'll burn more fat after the exercise compared to steady state aerobic. So the net effect is the same. See what I'm saying?
It's very similar. I actually think it's very similar, but I do believe low intensity, I mean, I could be wrong about this, but it's actually been proven more effective at burning fat in the long run.
It is true. Yeah, the maximum amount of fat, what they call fat max, for most people is 60% of maximum heart rate. That's very low. That's like a very low intensity level. That's when you burn the maximum fat, during exercise. But the thing is, what's interesting also, remember we mentioned cortisol. A lot of guys think cortisol is bad. And I mentioned that cortisol starts to rise after 1 hour of steady state aerobics. And I'm not saying it rises to the point of destroying muscle, it just rises. Now you might say, well, why does it rise? You know why it rises? Because after 1 hour, you're starting to, first of all, your glucose is being exhausted, you're circulating glucose, your glycogen is being dipped into, and your body wants to tap into more fat. So when cortisol is released at that point, interestingly enough, it's having a fat mobilizing effect. It's helping your lipocytes or fat cells release fat so you can use it as an energy source. Cortisol literally is a fat burning hormone. A lot of people don't know that. They think cortisol just breaks down muscle. They don't know it. And after the workout, with any workout, especially high intensity, you're going to have an elevated cortisol level after the workout, not necessarily during the workout, but after the workout. You say, wait a minute, isn't that bad? Isn't that going to prevent muscle growth? No. After the workout, the cortisol not only doesn't prevent muscle growth, but it helps to break down fat, which provides fuel for the repair and the increased muscle synthesis, including glycogen resynthesis that occurs as soon as you finish training. Cortisol after the workout is very beneficial. People don't understand that.
Now, this doesn't mean you should be walking around stressed all day and hoping to get big muscles, by the way.
No, constant cortisol.
I know, I'm just
you don't want that. No, you don't want
kidding.
that. No, seriously. High stress, which will increase cortisol. That's true. That's terrible situation.
Very bad for muscle building. Yeah, very bad.
Not just for muscle, but
for everything, really, your whole system. Yeah.
Yeah, people don't realize that constant stress with the high elevated cortisol in your brain slowly destroys the neurons in the brain. And they think there's a thing called minimal cognitive impairment. Simple term for that is older people call it senior moments, where you might forget where you put your keys. I mean, I get them myself. I mean, the other day I was looking for this knife I used, to cut my fruit.
Jesus, Jerry.
No, I couldn't find it, and I suddenly realized, my God, I think I threw it away. I absentmindedly threw my knife away. I can't find it anywhere. That was a senior moment. In my case, it wasn't due to cortisol. It was because they're doing construction in the area. I only had an hour and a half sleep. That'll increase cortisol. That'll cause memory impairment in a 20-year-old. So it wasn't any senior thing. But what I'm saying is that cortisol is terrible for your brain. It selectively destroys neurons in what they call the hippocampus section of the brain. That's the area most affected by Alzheimer's disease. It's the seat of memory, cognition, and intelligence. You don't want to walk around highly stressed.